I'll never forget the sound of boots stomping into my home. It was early morning, and I had just finished making breakfast for my kids when the door burst open without warning. Armed officers flooded in like a storm, shouting orders that made no sense to me. My heart sank as they grabbed me by the arms, ignoring my cries and protests. "What is this about?" I screamed, but all I got in return were cold stares and rough hands dragging me out of the house. My children stood frozen, tears streaming down their faces as I was shoved into the back of a police van. That day, March 27, 2024, marked the beginning of a nightmare I didn't think I'd survive. The ride to FCID Annex, Panty, Lagos felt endless. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it a mistake? A misunderstanding? But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't random, it was calculated. George, my husband, the man I had loved and supported through thick and thin, had orchestrated this. He used his influence to turn the law against me over something trivial, a personal debt he claimed I owed him, except it wasn't even real. It was an excuse, a weapon to destroy me. As we arrived at the detention center, the sight of its grim walls sent shivers down my spine. Little did I know, this was only the start of the horrors awaiting me. They threw me into a tiny cell that smelled of sweat and despair. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the dim light flickering above barely illuminated the space. Other women huddled together in corners, their eyes hollow with fear. No one spoke unless spoken to, and even then it was in whispers. I sat on the cold floor, pulling my knees close to my chest, trying to hold myself together. But inside, I was breaking apart. How could this be happening? Just hours ago, I was living a normal life, taking care of my family and believing I was safe. Now, I was trapped in a place where hope seemed impossible. Later that night, 2 officers came for me. They dragged me to a small room with a table and chairs where they began interrogating me. Their questions were relentless, circling the so-called debt George accused me of owing. When I denied it, they grew angrier, slamming their fists on the table. Except it wasn't even real. It was an excuse, a weapon to destroy me. One officer leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "If you don't do this," he whispered menacingly, "we'll make sure you regret it." His tone sent chills racing through me. For hours, I sat there staring at the screen, my fingers trembling over the keyboard. I thought about calling someone, anyone, who might help. But who would believe me? Who could fight against the system George had manipulated so expertly? Eventually, under relentless pressure, I transferred the money using the little savings I had left, knowing full well it wouldn't satisfy them. When I finished, they smirked like predators savoring their prey's despair. After the transfer, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd leave me alone. But I was wrong. That evening, another group of officers arrived, this time more aggressive than before. They accused me of lying, saying the amount wasn't enough to settle the fabricated debt. Their voices rose until they became deafening shouts, each word cutting deeper into my already fractured spirit. Then came the blows, first to my legs, then my back, until I collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. It wasn't just the physical pain that broke me, it was the realization that no matter what I did, they wouldn't stop. They couldn't stop, not while George held the strings. When they finally dragged me back to the cell, I couldn't move without crying out in agony. The other women avoided looking at me, either out of pity or fear of drawing attention to themselves. I lay curled up on the floor, replaying every moment of my life leading up to this point. How had it come to this? I had stood by George when he was nobody, supported him financially, emotionally, everything, and now he was destroying me. Betrayal burned like acid in my veins, eating away at whatever faith I once had in people. As darkness enveloped the cell, I closed my eyes, wishing I could disappear. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, my mind raced with questions. Would anyone find out what was happening to me? Or was I destined to rot here, forgotten by the world? By the 3rd day, I felt like I was losing my mind. The cell walls seemed to close in on me, and the constant hum of whispered conversations around me only added to the suffocating tension. My body ached from the beatings, but it was the mental toll that scared me the most. Every time footsteps approached, my heart would race, convinced they were coming for me again. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw George's smug face or heard the officer's cruel laughter ringing in my ears. I tried to cling to memories of happier times, but even those felt tainted now, twisted by the knowledge of what he had done. Was this how he repaid loyalty? By throwing me into hell itself? Then, late that night, something changed. A new officer appeared at the cell door. A tall man with sharp features and an unreadable expression. He called my name, his voice calm but firm. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, someone had intervened on my behalf. But as I followed him down the dimly lit hallway, dread settled in my chest. We didn't go to the interrogation room this time. Instead, he led me to a van waiting outside. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer, shoved me inside, and slammed the door shut. As the engine roared to life, panic surged through me. Wherever we were going, it couldn't be good. The ride to Abuja was long and silent, broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio in the front seat. I sat hunched in the back, hands cuffed together, staring out the window at the blur of trees and buildings passing by. My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Why Abuja? What awaited me there? The thought of being transferred to another facility filled me with terror, especially since I'd heard stories about places like Abattoir SARS detention. It was notorious for holding criminals far worse than me. Kidnappers, terrorists, murderers. If George had managed to get me sent there, then escape truly seemed impossible. Hours passed and exhaustion finally overtook fear. I drifted in and out of consciousness, waking occasionally to the sound of tires screeching or the driver shouting into his phone. When we finally arrived, the sight of the compound made my blood run cold. High walls topped with barbed wire loomed over us, and armed guards patrolled the perimeter like predators circling their territory. As they pulled me out of the van, I stumbled, my legs weak from hours of sitting cramped in the back. One guard grabbed my arm roughly, dragging me toward the entrance. "Welcome to Abattoir," he sneered, shoving me forward. The doors slammed shut behind me, sealing off any chance of freedom. The abattoir was worse than anything I could have imagined. The moment they pushed me inside, the stench hit me. Sweat, urine, and something metallic that made my stomach churn. The air was thick with despair, and the cries of inmates echoed off the walls like ghostly wails. They led me to a cell even smaller and darker than the one in Lagos. Inside, I found women huddled together, their faces gaunt and hollow. No one spoke as I entered. Instead, they stared at me with a mixture of pity and resignation. I slid down the wall, clutching my knees to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. This place wasn't just a prison. It was a tomb for the living, and I had been buried alive. That first night, I barely slept. Every creak of the door, every shout from the guards jolted me awake. My body throbbed from the beatings, but it was the silence of the other inmates that unnerved me the most. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, like a collective surrender to fate. At some point, a woman across from me began sobbing softly into her hands. No one comforted her. No one even acknowledged her pain. That's when it hit me. We weren't people here. We were shadows, forgotten by the world outside these walls. George had done this to me. He'd stripped away everything that made me human. And yet, despite the agony, anger burned deep within me. If I survived this, I vowed to make him pay. The nights in the abattoir were the worst. Just when you thought the day's horrors were over, the guards would come for you under the cover of darkness. On my second night, I woke to the sound of keys rattling against the cell lock. 2 officers stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the gloom like knives. "You," one said, pointing at me. My heart sank as they dragged me out into the hallway, my bare feet scraping against the cold floor. I didn't ask where we were going. I already knew. somewhere private, somewhere no one would hear me scream. They took me to a small, windowless room lit only by a single bulb swinging overhead. There they began their interrogation again, accusing me of hiding assets and conspiring against George. Each question felt like a punch to the gut, each answer met with laughter or sneers. When I refused to admit to lies I hadn't committed, one of them grabbed my hair and slammed my head against the table. Pain exploded in my skull and tears streamed down my face. Still, I refused to break. As they dragged me back to the cell hours later, blood trickling from a cut on my forehead, I realized something terrifying. They wanted to destroy me completely. The days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. In abattoir, time lost all meaning. Mornings brought stale bread and lukewarm water. Afternoons were filled with shouting matches between inmates or the distant sound of someone being beaten. Nights were reserved for fear, the kind that grips your chest and refuses to let go. But what scared me most wasn't the physical pain or even George's cruelty. It was the silence. The guards rarely spoke unless they were yelling, and the other women in my cell barely whispered. They had given up, resigned to their fates, but I couldn't bring myself to do the same. Every night as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I replayed every memory of George, every lie, every betrayal, and vowed not to let him win. Then, on the 5th day, something unexpected happened. A new inmate arrived, a young woman named Ada who looked like she hadn't eaten in weeks. Her eyes darted around the cell, wide with terror, until they landed on me. For reasons I couldn't explain, she trusted me enough to speak. "Why are you here?" she asked in a trembling voice. When I told her about George and the fabricated debt, her expression hardened. "Men like him think they own us," she spat bitterly. Her words struck a chord deep within me. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. Maybe others understood what it meant to be betrayed by someone you loved. For the first time since arriving at Abattoir, I felt a flicker of hope. Ada became my lifeline in that godforsaken place. Each night when the guard's footsteps faded into the distance, we'd huddle together in the corner of the cell and whisper plans for survival. She told me about her ordeal, how her ex-boyfriend had framed her for theft to avoid paying child support. Listening to her story made me realize how common our suffering was and how many women endured similar betrayals at the hands of men who claimed to love them. Together, we brainstormed ways to fight back, though neither of us knew if escape was possible. Still, talking about it gave me strength and reminded me that I wasn't just a victim, I was a survivor. One evening, Ada leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "There's a lawyer," she murmured. "Barrister Ifenie. He helped a friend of mine get out of here." My heart skipped a beat. Could it be true? Was there someone willing to stand up against the system George had manipulated so ruthlessly? Ada explained that Ifenie specialized in cases involving police brutality and extortion. If we could somehow get word to him, maybe, just maybe, he could help me too. The thought ignited a spark of determination inside me. I didn't know how I'd reach him or what price my freedom might cost, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to try. Anything was better than staying trapped in this nightmare forever. Getting a message to Barrister Ifenie felt like plotting an impossible escape. Ada warned me that any attempt to communicate with the outside world could get us both punished, or worse. But desperation outweighed the fear. That night, as the guards made their rounds, I scribbled a note on a scrap of paper I'd found in the corner of the cell. It was short and vague, just enough to explain my situation without giving away too much. "I am being held unlawfully at Abattoir SARS detention," it read. "Please help." I folded it tightly and tucked it into the waistband of my trousers, praying no one would notice. The next day, during our brief outdoor time, I slipped the note to another inmate who occasionally interacted with visitors. "Find someone named Barrister Ifenie," I whispered urgently. She nodded, her expression unreadable, and disappeared into the crowd. For days, I waited anxiously, jumping at every sound, scanning every face for signs of hope or betrayal. Would she deliver the message? Would Ifenie even believe me? Doubts gnawed at my mind, but Ada kept reassuring me. "If he's as good as they say, he'll come," she said firmly. Still, the uncertainty was maddening. Each passing hour felt like a lifetime, and the fear of failure weighed heavily on my chest. Then, on the seventh day, something changed. A guard called my name during breakfast, his tone unusually sharp. My heart sank as he led me out of the cell and into a small office where a man in a suit stood waiting. His presence was unexpected and terrifying. Was this a trick? Or had my plea finally reached someone who cared? The man introduced himself as Barrister Ifeanyi, his voice calm but commanding. He asked me to sit, his eyes studying me intently as though trying to gauge how much I'd endured. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My throat tightened with emotion and tears threatened to spill over. Finally, I managed to choke out my story, starting from the arrest and ending with the horrors of abattoir. As I spoke, Ifeanyi listened without interruption, his expression unreadable but focused. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "This isn't right," he said, his tone firm. "And I'm gonna do everything in my power to fix it." Hearing those words brought a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Could he really save me? Or was this just another cruel twist in George's game? Before leaving, Ifeanyi gave me strict instructions. Stay strong, don't trust anyone, and avoid drawing attention to myself. The system is corrupt, he explained, but there are cracks we can exploit. He promised to file a legal motion for my release and assured me he'd return soon with updates. As he walked away, I felt a flicker of hope ignite within me. A fragile flame that could easily be extinguished but still burn brightly enough to keep me going. Back in the cell, Ada noticed the change in my demeanor immediately. "Did he say he'll help?" she asked eagerly. I nodded, unable to hide my cautious optimism. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to dream of freedom, not just from abattoir, but from George's control. The days that followed felt like an eternity. Every knock on the cell door made my heart race, expecting it to be Ifeanyi or one of his associates bringing news. But nothing came, just the same monotonous routine of stale food, harsh lights, and sleepless nights. Ada tried to keep my spirits up, reminding me that legal battles took time, especially in a place as corrupt as this. Still, doubt crept in. What if George had already countered Ifeanyi's efforts? What if the system was too broken for anyone to fix? Each unanswered question gnawed at my resolve, threatening to drag me back into despair. I clung to the memory of Ifeanyi's calm voice, repeating his promise over and over in my head like a mantra: stay strong, stay invisible. Then, late one night, the guards came for me again. But this time something was different. Instead of dragging me to another interrogation room, they escorted me to a small office where a uniformed officer sat behind a desk. His demeanor was unusually polite, almost apologetic. "You're being transferred," he said curtly, handing me a document. My hands trembled as I scanned the paper. It was an order stating I'd be moved to a holding facility pending further investigation. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with suspicion. Was this part of George's plan to silence me permanently? Or was it really the first step toward freedom? As they led me out of abattoir, I couldn't help but wonder if the worst was yet to come. The new facility wasn't much better than abattoir, but at least the guards here didn't seem eager to hurt me. For the first time in weeks, I was allowed a phone call, a lifeline to the outside world. With shaking fingers, I dialed my sister's number, praying she'd answer. When her voice crackled through the line, I broke down completely. "They've locked me up," I sobbed, barely able to form coherent sentences. She listened silently, her breathing heavy on the other end. Finally, she spoke, her tone fierce. "We'll get you out of there, no matter what it takes." Her words reignited a flicker of hope inside me, though guilt quickly followed. How could I explain everything that had happened, the lies, the beatings, George's betrayal, without sounding like I was losing my mind? After hanging up, I spent hours replaying the conversation in my head. Would my family believe me? Could they rally enough support to challenge George's influence? These questions haunted me, but so did a deeper fear. Even if I got out, Would I ever truly escape him? He had poisoned every aspect of my life, turning the law against me, destroying my reputation, and leaving scars that might never heal. That night, as I lay on the thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, I realized something painful but undeniable. I couldn't undo the damage he'd done. All I could do was fight to reclaim what was left of myself, and for the first time, I felt ready to try. The next morning, my sister arrived at the facility with a storm in her eyes. She wasn't alone. Our older brother trailed behind her, his jaw clenched tight. Seeing them made my chest ache with a mix of relief and shame. I hated that they had to see me like this, broken and humiliated. But their presence was a lifeline I desperately needed. We were ushered into a small visiting room where we sat across from each other on hard plastic chairs. My sister grabbed my hands, her grip firm but trembling. "Tell us everything," she demanded, her voice low but urgent. So I did. I told them about George's betrayal, the false charges, the beatings, and the endless nights in abattoir. By the time I finished, tears streamed down all our faces. But beneath the sadness, I saw something else in their expressions. Anger. My brother leaned forward, his voice steady despite the fury simmering beneath it. "We're going to tear him apart," he said, his words sharp as steel. "No one does this to our family." Their determination gave me strength, but it also scared me. Going after George meant confronting not just him, but the web of corruption he'd woven around us. What if they got hurt trying to protect me? Still, I couldn't deny the comfort their support brought. For so long, I had felt utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare no one could understand. Now, sitting there with my siblings, I realized I wasn't fighting alone anymore. And for the first time since my arrest, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could win. Over the next few days, my siblings worked tirelessly to gather evidence against George. They hired private investigators, reached out to journalists, and even contacted old friends who might have dirt on him. Meanwhile, Barrister Afioni kept pushing forward with the legal battle, filing motions to challenge the validity of the charges against me. Each update they shared filled me with cautious optimism, though fear lingered in the back of my mind. What if George found out what we were doing? What if he retaliated? These questions haunted me, but I refused to let them paralyze me. Instead, I focused on surviving each day, holding on to the hope that justice might finally be within reach. One afternoon, Ifeanyi visited again, this time with news that sent shockwaves through me. "We've uncovered bank records showing transfers between George and some high-ranking police officials," he explained, sliding a folder across the table. "It's proof he orchestrated your arrest." My hands shook as I flipped through the documents, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the smoking gun we needed to expose him. But as elation bubbled inside me, a darker thought surfaced. Exposing George wouldn't just destroy him, it would drag our entire life into the spotlight. Our marriage, his rise to wealth, the affairs. He'd stop at nothing to bury the truth. As much as I wanted revenge, I couldn't ignore the cost of dragging everything into the open, yet deep down, I knew I had no choice. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of what we were about to do pressed down on me like a physical force. Exposing George meant unraveling years of lies. Not just his, but mine too. I had kept silent for so long, hiding the cracks in our marriage to protect my family's image. Now, those secrets would explode into public view, leaving nothing untouched. My children, my friends, even strangers. Everyone would know how thoroughly I'd been betrayed. The thought made me sick to my stomach, but as much as it terrified me, staying quiet was no longer an option. Every bruise on my body, every tear I'd cried in that cell, screamed for justice. If George thought he could destroy me without consequences, he was wrong. The next morning, Ifeanyi called with another update. He'd submitted the evidence to the court and filed a formal complaint against the officers involved in my arrest. "This is going to get messy," he warned, his tone serious but reassuring. "But we have the upper hand now." His words gave me courage, though doubt still lingered. What if the system was too corrupt to act? What if George found a way to twist the narrative again? I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the plan ahead. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just reacting, I was fighting back. And no matter how hard George tried to silence me, I knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't win this time. A week later, the media storm began. Journalists swarmed outside the detention center, shouting questions and snapping photos as I walked under heavy escort to a waiting car. Barrister Ifeanyi had orchestrated the release strategically, ensuring the press caught wind of my case before George could spin it his way. Headlines blared accusations against him, detailing everything from his fraudulent dealings to his alleged ties with corrupt officials. Watching him squirm under the spotlight felt surreal. For years, he'd controlled every aspect of my life, manipulating events to suit his needs. Now, the tables had turned and the world was watching. George didn't take it lying down. Within hours, his lawyers issued statements denying all allegations, painting me as a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge. It stung, hearing him twist the truth yet again, but I refused to let it shake me. Instead, I leaned harder into the fight, working with Ifeanyi and my siblings to gather more evidence. We dug up old bank statements, emails, and testimonies from people who had witnessed his cruelty firsthand. Each piece of proof added fuel to the fire, chipping away at the facade he'd built around himself. By the end of the week, even some of his closest allies started distancing themselves, afraid of being dragged into the scandal. As the walls closed in around him, I allowed myself a small smile. Justice might be slow, but it was finally catching up. As the scandal grew, George's carefully constructed empire began to crumble. Business partners cut ties with him, citing ethical concerns, while banks froze his accounts pending investigations into alleged money laundering. The man who once strutted through life as though untouchable now looked like a cornered animal, lashing out at anyone he perceived as a threat, including me. One evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It was short and chilling. "You'll regret this." My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, anger and fear warring inside me. He thought he could still intimidate me, even now, but he was wrong. I wasn't the same woman he'd locked away in that cell. The next day, Ifeanyi warned me that George might try to retaliate. "He's desperate," he said, his voice grim. "People like him don't go down without a fight." I nodded, understanding what he meant, but refusing to back down. Every threat, every attempt to scare me only strengthened my resolve. With each passing day, more witnesses came forward. Former employees, mistresses, even distant relatives, all willing to testify about his cruelty and corruption. Their stories painted a picture of a man consumed by greed and power, someone who saw people as tools to be used and discarded. As the evidence mounted, I felt something shift inside me. Not just relief, but clarity. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about exposing the truth, no matter how ugly it was. But fighting George wasn't without risks. One night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard the sound of tires screeching outside my temporary safe house. My heart raced as I peeked through the blinds, expecting to see headlights or shadows. Instead, the street remained eerily quiet, as if the noise had been nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I called Ifeanyi, his response was immediate. "Don't go anywhere alone, not even for a minute." His words sent a chill down my spine, but they also reminded me of how far we'd come and how much further we still had to go. The following morning, another bombshell dropped. A whistleblower leaked documents proving George had bribed officials not just to arrest me, but to cover up years of illegal activities. Their stories painted a picture of a man consumed by greed and power, someone who saw people as tools to be used and discarded. As the evidence gathered outside government buildings demanding accountability, while hashtags calling for justice trended online. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. The world was watching, and they were on my side. But even as hope surged, so did fear. George was dangerous when cornered, and I knew he wouldn't stop until he either destroyed me or himself. Either way, I braced for the worst, knowing the battle was far from over. The tension reached a breaking point one night when I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my safe house. At first, I thought it was paranoia creeping in again. After all, living under constant threat had made me jumpy. But then I heard it again. Soft, deliberate steps moving along the side of the house. My breath caught in my throat as I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help. The footsteps paused near my bedroom window, and I froze, staring at the thin curtains separating me from whoever or whatever was out there. For a moment, everything was still. Then suddenly, something struck the glass with a sharp thud, making me jump back with a gasp. Instead, I leaned harder into the fight, working with Ifini to prepare for the upcoming court hearings. Every deposition, every affidavit brought us closer to holding him accountable, not just for what he'd done to me, but for the lives he'd ruined along the way. During one particularly grueling prep session, Ifini looked at me with a mix of admiration and concern. "You're stronger than most people realize," he said quietly. "But strength doesn't mean invincible. Be careful, okay?" His words struck a chord deep within me. Fighting George forced me to confront not just his cruelty, but also my fears and insecurities. I'd spent years believing I needed him, that without his approval or support, I was nothing. Now, standing on the brink of justice, I realized how wrong I'd been. I wasn't weak, I was resilient. And though the road ahead would be long and dangerous, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let him take that away from me. The first day in court felt like stepping into a lion's den. Reporters packed the gallery, their cameras flashing like strobe lights as I walked in, flanked by Ifeanyi and my siblings. George sat across the aisle, his polished suit and smug expression masking the cracks beneath. He glanced at me briefly, his eyes cold and calculating before turning his attention to his lawyers. For a moment, I faltered. How could I stand against someone who seemed so untouchable? Then I remembered the bruises on my body, the nights spent sobbing in that cell, and the faces of all the women he'd betrayed like me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every voice he tried to silence. When my turn came to testify, the room felt eerily quiet. My hands trembled as I recounted everything, the arrest, the beatings, the extortion. But my voice remained steady. Each word felt like pulling thorns from my skin, painful but necessary. When I finished, the judge stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to George's team and asked pointedly, "Do you have evidence refuting these claims?" Their hesitation spoke volumes. As I returned to my seat, Ifeanyi gave me a small nod of approval. We weren't done yet, but for the first time, I saw real fear flicker in George's eyes. He was losing control, and he knew it. After the hearing, whispers buzzed through the courthouse like wildfire. Journalists scrambled to file reports while spectators debated whether George would walk away unscathed or face consequences for his actions. Outside, protesters held signs demanding justice, their chants echoing off the walls. Despite the chaos, I felt a strange sense of calm. Testifying had been exhausting, but it also reinforced why I was fighting, to expose the truth, no matter how ugly it was. That evening, Ifeanyi called with an update. More witnesses had come forward, including former business partners accusing George of embezzlement and fraud. But the victory was bittersweet. Later that night, as I scrolled through news articles online, I stumbled across comments blaming me for ruining George's life. Some accused me of greed, others of vindictiveness, dismissing my pain as mere spite. Reading them made my chest tighten with anger and sadness. Did they not understand what I'd endured, or were they too blinded by his charm to see the monster underneath? I wanted to respond, to scream at them that I hadn't chosen this fight. It had been forced upon me. But Ifeni's advice echoed in my mind: don't engage. Instead, I focused on the facts, the evidence, and the truth. Because in the end, that's all that mattered. The public reaction to my case weighed heavily on me, but nothing compared to the toll it took on my children. They were caught in the crossfire, their lives turned upside down by headlines and gossip. One afternoon, my youngest son asked me, "Why does everyone hate us?" His voice trembled and tears filled his eyes. It broke my heart to see him so confused and afraid. I knelt beside him, holding his hands tightly in mine. "They don't hate us," I said softly. "They just don't understand yet. But one day they will." Even as I reassured him, guilt gnawed at me. Had I made the right choice by dragging this into the open? Or had I only caused more pain for the people I loved most? That night, I called Ifeanyi, voicing my fears. He listened patiently before responding, "You're doing the right thing for your kids, for yourself, and for every woman who's ever been silenced by someone like George." His words gave me strength, but they didn't erase the ache in my chest. Fighting back wasn't just about seeking justice. It was about teaching my children that they deserved better, that no one should have to endure what we'd been through. As much as I hated putting them through this, I knew deep down that staying silent would have hurt them even more. So I pressed on, clinging to the hope that someday they'd understand why I couldn't let George win. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, another bombshell dropped. One of George's former mistresses, a woman named Chioma, came forward with explosive claims. Not only had he infected her with an STD, but he'd also threatened her family when she tried to leave him. Her testimony sent shockwaves through the media and added fuel to the fire surrounding our case. For days, reporters camped outside my safe house begging for interviews. While part of me wanted to speak out, Ifeanyi advised against it. "Let the evidence do the talking," he said firmly. "Your story is powerful enough without sensationalizing it." But George wasn't about to let this slide. Within hours, his lawyers filed a countersuit accusing me of defamation and conspiracy. Their goal was clear: distract from the mounting evidence against him and paint me as the villain. At first, the accusations shook me. How could anyone believe his lies after everything he'd done? Then I remembered something important. The truth has a way of shining through, no matter how hard you try to bury it. With renewed determination, I focused on preparing for the next round of hearings. George might think he still held all the cards, but I knew better. Every move he made only dug his grave deeper. The countersuit hit me harder than I expected. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that George was somehow still ahead of us, manipulating the system like he always had. His lawyers painted him as the victim, spinning tales about how I'd fabricated the entire story out of jealousy and greed. It felt like being thrown back into that cell all over again, powerless, silenced, and betrayed. But this time, I wasn't alone. Ifeanyi reminded me that countersuits were a desperate tactic, a sign that George was running out of options. "He's scared," Ifeanyi said firmly. "And when people are scared, they make mistakes." Still, doubt lingered in my mind. What if the judge believed him? What if the truth didn't matter in the end? One evening, exhausted from the constant battle, I sat with Ada on a video call. She'd been released from abattoir weeks earlier thanks to Ifeanyi's efforts, and hearing her voice brought me comfort. "You're stronger than you think," she told me, her tone unwavering. "George can throw all the dirt he wants, but it won't stick. Not when everyone knows who he really is." Her words struck a chord deep within me. I realized then that this fight wasn't just about winning, it was about refusing to let his lies define me. No matter what happened next, I vowed not to give up, not for myself, and certainly not for him. As the trial progressed, cracks began to show in George's defense. Witnesses contradicted each other, documents mysteriously disappeared, and even some of his closest allies started distancing themselves publicly. One former associate, a man named Samuel, testified under oath that George had bribed officials to fabricate evidence against me. His confession sent shockwaves through the courtroom, leaving George visibly shaken for the first time. Watching him squirm under scrutiny gave me a sense of vindication, though it wasn't enough to erase the scars he'd left behind. One evening, exhausted from the constant battle, I sat with Ada on a video call. She'd been released from abattoir weeks earlier thanks to Ifeanyi's efforts, and hearing her voice brought me comfort. "You're stronger than you think," she told me, her tone unwavering. "George can throw all the dirt he wants, but it won't stick. Not when everyone knows who he really is." Her words struck a chord deep within me. I realized then that this fight wasn't just about winning, it was about refusing to let his lies define me. No matter what happened next, I vowed not to give up, not for myself and certainly not for him. 2 days later, I received another anonymous text. This time, the message was more explicit. Drop the case or your kids pay the price. My blood ran cold as I stared at the screen, anger and terror warring inside me. How dare he threaten my children? How could he sink so low? I immediately forwarded the message to Ifeanyi, who contacted the authorities to trace its origin, but deep down I knew tracing it wouldn't stop George. Not entirely. He thrived on fear, using it to control those around him. That evening, I sat down with my kids, their faces pale with worry. Listen carefully, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. No matter what happens, you stay safe, you stick together, promise me that. They nodded solemnly, though I could see the fear in their eyes. It broke my heart to drag them into this mess, but I refused to let George win. Not now, not ever. As I tucked them into bed that night, I made a silent vow. If protecting my family meant destroying him completely, then so be it. He had underestimated me once. He wouldn't get the chance again. The threats against my children pushed me to the edge. I spent sleepless nights pacing the house, jumping at every sound outside. Ifeanyi increased security around us, but no amount of protection could fully ease the gnawing fear in my chest. One morning, as I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized myself. The woman looking back at me had dark circles under her eyes, hollow cheeks, and a weary expression that spoke of battles fought and yet to come. But there was something else in her gaze, steel. I wouldn't let George destroy what little remained of my life. That afternoon, during a strategy meeting with Ifeanyi, I made a decision. We expose everything, I said firmly. Not just the legal case, but the truth about who he is. The affairs, the abuse, the lies. Let the world see him for what he really is. Ifeanyi hesitated, his brow furrowing. It'll be messy, he warned. Are you ready for that? I nodded without hesitation. George had tried to silence me with fear, but I refused to live in the shadows any longer. If this were the price of justice, I'd pay it, Dan, make sure. He paid tenfold. The press release went out the next day, detailing every sordid detail of George's betrayal. Not just mine, but those of countless others. Women came forward in droves, sharing their stories of manipulation, abuse, and deceit. Social media exploded with hashtags like "expose the truth" and "justice for her," flooding timelines with outrage and solidarity. For the first time, I felt the tide turning, not just for me, but for everyone he'd hurt. The sheer volume of voices drowned out his attempts to discredit us, leaving him floundering in the public eye. Backlash wasn't limited to George. Trolls targeted me too, accusing me of ruining families and tearing lives apart. Their venom stung, but I refused to let it break me. Instead, I focused on the messages of support pouring in from strangers, women thanking me for speaking out, and mothers vowing to protect their daughters from men like him. Each word of encouragement fortified my resolve. This fight wasn't just personal anymore. It was a stand against the kind of cruelty that thrived in silence. And I knew deep down, no matter how hard George fought back, he couldn't undo what we'd started. The final hearing arrived amidst a frenzy of media coverage. Reporters packed the courtroom, cameras flashing as I walked in, flanked by Ifeanyi and my siblings. George sat across the aisle, his once imposing presence diminished by exhaustion and desperation. When the judge entered, the room fell silent, anticipation hanging thick in the air. After hours of deliberation, she delivered her verdict. Guilty on all counts: fraud, bribery, extortion, and abuse of power. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery as the weight of the ruling sank in. As the bailiffs led George away in handcuffs, our eyes met briefly. His were filled with rage and disbelief, while mine burned with quiet triumph. Justice had been served. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to remind him that no one was above accountability. As I left the courthouse, surrounded by cheers and applause, tears streamed down my face. Not tears of sadness, but of relief. The nightmare was finally over. or so I thought. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could be after such upheaval. My children adjusted to school routines again, though they remained wary of strangers and sudden noises. We attended counseling together, working through the trauma George had inflicted on our family. It wasn't easy, but each session brought us closer to healing. Meanwhile, I started rebuilding my life. With the help of friends and family, I launched a foundation to support women trapped in abusive relationships. Sharing my story gave others the courage to speak up, creating a ripple effect of empowerment and change. Though scars remained, both visible and invisible, I found solace in knowing I'd turned pain into purpose. Every survivor who reached out to thank me reminded me why I'd fought so hard. And though the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, I knew I'd walk it with my head held high. Months later, standing on the balcony of my new home, I watched the sunrise paint the sky in hues of gold and pink. The past year had been a whirlwind of chaos and resilience, but now, peace settled over me like a warm blanket. My kids laughed in the yard below, their joy infectious. They were healing, growing stronger with each passing day, and so was I. George's empire lay in ruins, his name synonymous with corruption and cruelty. He lingered in prison, awaiting additional charges stemming from ongoing investigations. Though part of me still carried anger toward him, most days I felt nothing but indifference. He no longer had the power to define me or dictate my worth. Looking back, I realized the hardest battles weren't fought in courtrooms or headlines. They were waged within myself. Learning to forgive didn't mean forgetting, it meant choosing freedom over bitterness. As the sun rose higher, casting light over everything, I whispered a silent promise to the universe I would never stop fighting for justice, for love, and for the future I deserved.